This is Monica Perez. And before we start our final chapter of The Makers of the Modern Mind, part one of Dewey, Teachers as Social Engineers, I have some super duper sad news that I'm still not fully absorbing, but it will mean something to everyone from the propaganda report community, the Monica Perez show, cognitive dissidents, our good friend Joe Tundra, aka Joe Not a Fed, died. He was on a motorcycle ride. He had an accident. I don't know why, what caused that. And then after the accident, although he did survive, he had a heart attack. And he was a great friend, a great person in our community. When I really worried about something, health or like this, when the fire happened, I called him several times. He was a wealth of information, so supportive, just a really good, authentic, truly worthwhile person. And I have noticed that it's not possible to absorb the magnitude of a loss of a quality person, a human being of quality. It's not possible to fully appreciate that. So I would just ask that I'm just going to take 10 seconds because that's how long it takes to say a Hail Mary. And I'm going to say Hail Mary for Joe. And I would ask anyone listening to take those 10 seconds and offer up a prayer. I've heard, depending on what you believe in, that love can reach that soul. And we want Joe to know that we love him. So I will continue with our reading. We're going to start with our subject on Dewey. I hope you don't hear too much madness in the background. We are on our second day of having the insulation sucked out of our attic. I was going to wait until all the construction was done around here because there's dust still coming in, but they did a study and there is a lot of lead in the ash on top of the insulation. I mean, I don't think I'm breathing it in a lot, but you want to get rid of that. So not only are they doing that, but the doors are open and I'm in here with lovely Arturo, who does occasionally erupt in explosive, heart-stopping barking. So we're having him trained and he's really coming along. So hopefully he won't do that. But let us try to get to the bottom of what's happened to our education. And I want to point out that Dewey, this is not the Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System. And I think I was on, whose show was I on? Angry Tiger. And I was like reaching behind me, pulling out the books they were talking about. And I believe that they thought there should be a Perez decimal system or I'm Monica Dewey. But anyway, there's no shame in that because it is not this Dewey. He's bad Dewey. Okay, let's hit it. Teachers as Social Engineers, subtitle of the Dewey chapter. The year 1859 is one of curious coincidences. Darwin's Origin of Species and Marx's Critique of Political Economy were published that year, as we have seen, as was John Stuart Mill's epochal, E-P-O-C-H-A-L, epochal essay on liberty. I think we've probably all read that. I should read that next. In that same year, Washington Irving died, an outstanding representative of the older America, and another American destined greatly to influence the formation of modern thought was born in Vermont. Can I say figures? John Dewey was one of the few makers of the modern mind who lived to see his ideas widely adopted and even, to some extent, to outlive some of his doctrines. For Dewey's instrumentalism was most popular in philosophy, and his progressive theories and techniques in education in the 1920s and 1930s when he was about 70 to 80 years old. What? For Dewey's instrumental is most popular in philosophy and his progressive theories and techniques in education. Okay. By the time he died in his 93rd year, many of his warmest admirers and pupils had died or retired, and another generation of philosophers and educators held the power wielding positions in the universities and school systems throughout the land. But even this newer generation was very much affected by the writings of John Dewey and his followers. Dewey is a recent, but nonetheless towering figure in the history of American thought and education. The first volume of the Library of Living Philosophers, published in 1939, was The Philosophy of John Dewey, and he was considered of such unquestioned importance that a large volume in the Makers of the American Tradition series was published on him 2 years after he died in 1952. Few would disagree with the judgment of Irwin Edmond that, quote, for half a century now, both those who have agreed and those who have disagreed with the major views of John Dewey have recognized in him a force to be dealt with, a leader to follow or to counter, a thinker to affirm or rebut. For better, as many thousands have believed, for worse, as some articulate critics have insisted, Dewey is being recognized now as one of the fashioners or refashioners of contemporary thinking. End quote. If it is correct to call anything or anyone, quote, typically American, John Dewey is the typically American philosopher. In the profoundest sense, George H. Mead said at the celebration of Dewey's 70th birthday in 1929, John Dewey is the philosopher of America. He is to American thought what movies and baseball are to American pastime. Moreover, like movies and baseball, Dewey's thought has been taken up in other parts of the world and has affected the school systems of a number of countries. Our apologies to those countries. I hate that that's what America stands for. John Dewey was very much like John Locke in being a philosopher of common sense who made experience his guide and his norm. But his ambition was Cartesian rather than Lockean, for he rejected in a sweep the entire 2,000 and more years of philosophy that preceded him to adopt new philosophic principles and to build a new set of values. Philosophic theories, he tells us, which are products of pre-scientific and pre-technological, dominantly leisure class conditions, are now as obstructive as they are unnecessary. Therefore, quote, the chief task of those who call themselves philosophers is to help get rid of the useless lumber that blocks our highways of thought and strive to make straight and open the paths that lead to the future. I read a quote once, something to the effect of, all ideas are Greek in origin. So if you eliminate the ideas from the past, you have no ideas, and you have to reinvent them, and that will take more than a lifetime than one of us has. Not cool. That's why I like the classics, especially when you're a kid. I was thinking about this, if I may take a pause. I was thinking about The Death of a Salesman. I think I read it in high school. It's, I didn't even understand why a salesman was something to be like, what's wrong with being a salesman? Like, why is this guy depressed of mediocrity? The Tolstoy stuff, like The Death of Ivan Ilyich and some of the, like, his bureaucrats, soulless bureaucrats, I get. But I was thinking, why are you talking to high schoolers about that? Why are you having them read that? Is it because it resonates with them? It explains their lives. It gives voice to something that they've been living with and couldn't vent? No, that may be, I think that's why things are written. That's why things should be written. That's what philosophy is written for, the people who are thinking about it, trying to figure it out. But you ever give that stuff to a kid, you are shaping their expectations and their interpretations of the future, of what they experience. Oh, this is like Willy Loman, not, oh, this is a stepping stone to a better life. Like, you can do a lot of damage. So this is the kind of thing where they take away those profound truths that have been accumulating one by one in different bodies of thought and different works of literature. You're taking away the foundation for good moral life, which is found, I think, in the classics, and it's like what they did in the 60s. They wiped away the whole thing. Yeah, there were a few things wrong. There were big things wrong, but the foundations were valid, like the Bill of Rights. The foundations are valid. Yes, there was slavery at that time. Yes, abolish the slavery, don't abolish the Bill of Rights. So I think the clean slate thing is just a way to undermine existing values that have stood the test of time, and bind the society. I mean, now you all know exactly what I'm talking about. So no one can cut clean from the past, as we saw with Descartes. Nevertheless, although Dewey failed to discredit all previous philosophers, he did succeed in joining their ranks as an influential formulator of modern thought. In many respects, his followers carried his ideas to lengths to which he would himself never go, especially in the field of education, where extreme progressive education became a caricature of what Dewey had in mind. Well, of what Dewey said he had in mind. You're not going to start with the stuff that people would so totally reject. They wouldn't. It's incrementalism. It must have embarrassed Dewey, for example, to hear one admirer assert at his 70th birthday celebration that, quote, "We think of Professor Dewey as the most profound and understanding thinker on education that the world has yet known." And he went on, "Plato's Republic was the most important book ever written on education until John Dewey wrote his Democracy in Education." Yeah, it sounds like that's what he was after. Despite these exaggerations, it must be admitted that Dewey is indirectly and partly responsible both for many improvements in educational practice and for many problems of child-centered education, quote, "with a minimum of subject matter and absolutely no discipline." William H. Kilpatrick, who as professor of education at Teachers College and Columbia University has done more than anyone to apply Dewey's theories to education, said in 1929 that school life everywhere in our country and in many distant parts is finer and sweeter and more fruitful because of what he has taught. To which should be added that the problems created by this sweeter type of education are also attributable in part to Dewey. Nor has Dewey's influence been confined to educational practice. It has been pronounced in philosophy, and it has flowed over into social thought, industrial relations, human relations, councils, and almost every aspect of American life. Such prominent Americans as Oliver Wendell Holmes, Walter Reuter, and Jane Addams have all testified to the influence Dewey had upon them, as of course thousands of teachers have also done. So, though he has been dead only 5 years, it does not seem presumptuous to acknowledge that John Dewey has taken his place among the dozen makers of the modern mind whose influence we feel strongly today. Section 1. To understand the working of Dewey's mind, it is more important to know where he lived and whom he met than what books he read. For Dewey's is a philosophy of experience, and from his everyday experience, he encountered the problems and devised the methods from which he constructed his body of thought. Quote, "Upon the whole," he has written, "the forces that have influenced me have come from persons and from situations more than from books. It is this absorption quality of his nature that enabled Dewey to become the philosophical quintessence of American society. He was fortunate in the connections he made in the formative years of his early manhood, for he associated with some of the best minds of the time, independent thinkers who were abreast of the latest philosophical thought in Germany and England and were able to reformulate it in an American setting." Is this like during the eugenics period? Dewey was born in Burlington, Vermont, of a family that had been farmers, wheelwrights, and blacksmiths. His father was in the grocery business, a man with a shrewd, practical outlook tempered by rather wide reading in such classical authors as Milton and Shakespeare. Dewey's attitude towards school as an activity and a phase of living seems to have been based on his own experience, for he claimed that he learned mostly by doing things at home and in the neighborhood rather than in the classroom. At any rate, his youth was that of a typical 19th century Vermonter with a first-hand respect for first-hand experience, a shrewdness about things practical, and a strong but essentially negative religious and moral tradition. John attended the University of Vermont, then a small college with a faculty of 8 teaching the, quote, old standard subjects of Latin, Greek, ancient history, mathematics, philosophy, and science. Sounds like a good start. In these years from 1875 to 1879, discussion in higher academic circles centered about evolution and its associated ideas, and Dewey was introduced to these discussions in reading the English periodicals to which the university library subscribed. The one experience which seems to have struck him most forcefully, however, was studying Thomas Huxley's text in a physiology course. It presented an impressive picture of the oneness of living creatures, which appealed strongly to Dewey, and, he tells us, permanently affected his thinking. After graduation, Dewey taught high school for 3 years, an experience which was to give considerable direction to his philosophy. And then in 1882, he enrolled for graduate work in philosophy at the Johns Hopkins University. There, young Dewey took on the Hegelian philosophy of his principal professor, George S. Morris. Although he eventually shed Hegelian thought, his immersion in it, he admits, left a permanent deposit in his thinking. It appealed to him, as Huxley had done, because it unified all being in the absolute mind, as against the British empirical and older Greek dualistic philosophies. In time, Dewey was to find a substitute for the absolute mind in the social and cultural matrix. But for about 20 years, he can be classified as an Hegelian? Let's say a Hegelian. Dewey finished his doctoral work in 1884 and went to Michigan University, where Morris had returned as head of the philosophy department. Dewey believes that the faculty associations at Michigan did much to give him his faith in democracy, for the older professors treated young instructors as equals, and the weekly faculty meeting became a truly educative process. I have to say something about the word democracy. I just always think of it as voting. And then I realized that my daughter, my husband, and the babysitter all had the same car, a Honda Accord. And I thought, oh, that is the democratization of cars, like a car. It's great. So I try to think more expansively about that word. Although our democracy is not in the running for any valid reading of democracy. Dewey remained at Michigan University with the exception of 1 year spent at Minnesota University until 1894 when he went to Chicago University. According to his own autobiographical sketch, these were important years of intellectual formation from his 25th to his 35th years. He remained an Hegelian throughout, but his position was modified and his interests altered by a number of influences. William James's Principles of Psychology, Dewey tells us, worked its way more and more into all my ideas and acted as a ferment to transform old beliefs. James had rejected rational psychology, which had been a subdivision of philosophy, to base the study on biology and on experiment. A second major influence on Dewey in these years at Ann Arbor was his contact with the elementary and secondary schools. His interest in psychology led him to study the learning process and to lecture to teachers' conventions and institutes on such subjects as attention, memory, and thinking, all in quotes. His conclusion was that the existing methods of education in the primary and secondary schools were unsound psychologically and almost useless as a preparation for adult life or for college. When Dewey was offered the headship of the Department of Philosophy at Chicago University in 1894, he accepted on condition that it include psychology and pedagogy. Dewey's 10 years in Chicago were perhaps the most important decade for the development of his philosophical and pedagogical theories. In these years, he established what was probably the first, quote, progressive school. This was the laboratory school, established under the auspices of Dewey's department to try new pedagogic methods and to experiment with revised curriculum as well as different techniques. Dewey was also friendly with Ella Flagg Young. I really thought that said Egg Foo Young, which is delicious, by the way. Ella Flagg Young, a district superintendent of schools in Chicago, and Jane Addams, the directress of the famous social settlement known as Hull House. His firsthand knowledge of the school system and his many visits to Hull House, he tells us, played a large part in formulating his educational theories. Meanwhile, he enjoyed the advantage of teaching graduate classes in which he could work out his own philosophical position. Step by step, he moved out of Hegelianism and into a new position which was closer to James's pragmatism than any other system of thought. His must be a philosophy, Dewey held, which would square with experience and would therefore be based on the latest scientific and technological developments. In 1904, Dewey resigned from Chicago University and went to Columbia University, where he remained for the rest of his academic life. He enjoyed certain advantages at Columbia University, which contributed both to his continuing personal development and to his worldwide influence. He lectured 2 hours a week in the university's Teachers College, which became the vehicle for infusing his philosophy of education into literally thousands of future superintendents of education throughout this country and in many other lands. The graduates of Teachers College, in time, formed something like an interlocking directorate in American public education, and they also became the dominant influence in departments of education in many universities and in most normal or teacher training schools. In the last half century of his life, Dewey also enjoyed the company of many outstanding American thinkers who lived in the New York area and met frequently to exchange ideas. Thus, he saw almost every variety of American thought well defended and expertly attacked, and from these verbal tilts, he picked up both ideas and attitudes which modified his own position. Dewey was probably the most influential educator in the country when he retired in 1929, but he lived an active life for almost another quarter of a century, continuing to write books and articles and reviews, to give lectures as a professor emeritus, and to advise the countless men and women who personally or by correspondence came to the old sage with their problems. Thus, Dewey used all 92 years of his life to develop his philosophy and to extend his influence. Philosophers generally agree that his best philosophic work from a technical point of view was his Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, published in 1938 when he was almost 80. What kind of man was this only American to be included in our list of makers of the modern mind? He was typically American, and his thought reached maturity at the time that America was becoming a wealthy, progressive, and powerful nation. This is what Boyd H. Bode had in mind when he observed that, quote, Dewey's career would not have been possible at any previous time. Dewey had the typical American faith in democracy, in common sense and community experience, in the practical rather than the theoretical. He never lost certain qualities for which his native Vermont is well known. Trust in practical experiences and a bent towards pragmatism, a confidence in town meetings and the sharing of experiences and knowledge. After he left Vermont, he shed other New England qualities which might have inhibited the development of his naturalistic, pragmatic, and anti-traditional philosophy, such as belief in a supernatural religion and in objective moral standards. Dewey enjoyed remarkably good health, which enabled him to be active physically and mentally until shortly before his death. His mind was as sharp when he was 90 as when he was 45. He has been described by all who knew him as a likable person who never tried to be magisterial with younger or less accomplished associates. He seemed always willing to learn from his students and to rethink a subject in the light of additional information or a different point of view supplied by a student or an associate. Dewey seems to have maintained this intellectual adaptability only among those who agreed with him in basic principles and differed merely in minor matters. A Thomist, an Aristotelian, or a British empiricist, on the other hand, would have no influence whatsoever on Dewey, who had an almost pathological aversion to any dualist system. Partly because of the nature of, but he liked the Hegelian stuff. I don't know. Partly because of the nature of his thought and partly because of his temperament, Dewey was never a particularly effective teacher or lecturer. Moreover, his written style is lumbering and difficult, loose and full of abstractions that frequently have shifting meanings. The result is that it is sometimes almost impossible to know exactly what Dewey means, for some of his crucial terms, such as experience, remain undefined and somewhat ambiguous. Okay, so the guy who established the style and goals purposes of American world education for the last 100 years couldn't teach you what he wanted to say. And that's actually, I think, at the essence of his stuff, in that like the core curriculum couldn't exist without Dewey. Core curriculum is highly focused on like process over content. And I think that's what I kind of gleaned from Dewey, but I didn't remember that that his writing was ambiguous. I mean, maybe he wanted things to shift. Maybe that's why he was okay with new people giving him new interpretations of his stuff. Maybe he was after influence above all, or maybe he was after a profound subjectivism that would really gut education. I don't know. When a friend pointed out this defect to Dewey at a gathering, he is reported to have gestured toward a group of his followers and said, "Let some of these young men explain me. It will make a career for some of them." And it has. In his autobiographical sketch in Contemporary American Philosophy, Personal Statements, Dewey admits to a temperamental demand in his nature for unity. That is, an intense emotional craving. This hunger for unification has been explained as a reaction to the religious and moral doctrines taught to him as a youth, dualistic doctrines of God and creatures, body and soul, right and wrong, heaven and hell, this life and the next life. I actually think a lot of times people's aversion to that is that they don't want to follow the rules. They just want to do what they want to do. They like the rule, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. That's a popular rule for a reason. And I think if you don't like the difference between right and wrong, that doesn't make it not real, but it does betray, I think, your preferences. At any rate, we do know that it did influence his aversion to certain philosophical systems, such as Aristotelianism, and it played a commanding role in the formation of instrumentalism. Dewey also explains in his autobiography that he tended toward putting ideas in schematic form and was interested in the formally logical. These, he felt, were defects which cut him away from reality. So he worked against this inclination and put his emphasis on the concrete, the empirical, and the practical. That he succeeded is due largely to the contacts he made and the direction philosophy took in his middle years away from Hegelian thought toward the psychological, the concrete, and the empirical. Dewey seems to have absorbed a great deal of what was in the intellectual atmosphere, to have mulled it over in his own mind, and to have made it his own. This is not to discredit, because this is the procedure he believes proper to philosophy. Not to understand his absorption quality is to fail to understand how he progressed from Hegelian absolutism to instrumentalism. To follow this transformation in detail is unnecessary here. Let us only note that Darwin served as the convenient bridge for Dewey between Hegel and James, that Dewey worked through all three to his own system of experimentalism or instrumentalism, that he tried to replace the preceding 2,000 years of philosophy with what he thought was a fresh construct built on a scientific framework with the stuff of experience. He knew that the work was not completed by himself alone, but he believed that he had taken long strides in the right direction. Section 3. As has been the case with our previous makers of the modern mind, Dewey was influential not because he was wiser than other philosophers, but because he said what America wanted to hear. He seemed to put the great American experiment in philosophical terms, which emphasized its tremendous accomplishments and seemed to show them both wise and practically sound. In his excellent study on social thought in America, Morton G. White shows how Dewey was for philosophy, what Veblen was for economics. Oh my gosh, that's the guy that Preparata loves. Holmes for law, and Beard and Robinson for history. All of them insist upon coming to grips with life experiences, process, growth, context, function. They are all products of the historical and cultural emphases of the 19th century, following, being influenced by, reacting from its great philosophers of change and process. Each was revolutionary in that he wanted to break off from traditional thought and interpret reality as he saw it. Dewey was entirely successful in capturing the American experiment and expressing it philosophically. As one of his admirers has put it, he caught the voice, accent, and temper of the American tradition and the nature of the special contingencies and choices before it in his own era. His philosophy expresses the expanding force of technology, the rising tide of the labor movement, and the hostility to tradition, which were all part of the America in which he lived and formulated his thought. In Dewey, one finds the democratic faith with its almost paradoxical combination of individualism and community, sharing of experiences, as well as the confidence that both society and the environment can be reconstructed to make a better world. His admirers make the point that Dewey caught what they believe is the Central American tradition in the Midwest, where he found both citizens and students had little respect for tradition, and where they were all confident that, like pioneers of the past, they could remake their world by hard work along practical lines of solving problems, confronting them, and by self-reliance in working out their own solutions. Students at Michigan and Chicago universities in Dewey's day believed that Latin and Greek were survivals from an aristocratic past, and they favored practical subjects which prepared them to get things done and to reconstruct their communities along progressive lines. Dewey formulated his thought in the decades when America was being industrialized and urbanized under the leadership of the great captains of industry or robber barons. The term you use depends on your attitude toward the Rockefellers, Morgans, Carnegies, and Harrimans. This was the age not only of great industrial accomplishments, but also of much social unrest and the beginning of progressive reform that was to find legislative enactment under T.R. Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and especially Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These progressive reforms arose in the Midwest out of the Granger movement and the Populist Party, and they put faith in such democratic processes as direct election of senators. Big mistake. Initiative, and there's just no reason for that. That you have direct election of Congress. That's part of the checks and balances. Otherwise, you don't even need that. Initiative and referendum and recall. They called upon government to regulate industry in the interest of the farmers and the workers, and they laid great stress on the economic basis of democracy and the good life. Although the leaders of these reform movements stressed the evils of unrestrained capitalism, they by no means wanted to reject industrial progress or technological accomplishments in favor of a primitive life. They believed that their proposals would promote progress and enable all classes to share in it equitably. Dewey, we find, sponsored all these practical, quote, liberal reform measures. But more important, the ever-changing and ever-building American scene seems to have entered into the very heart of his philosophy of continual reconstruction, a reconstruction not accomplished deductively, but rather empirically by inquiry into the experiences confronting us at every successive turn. That sounds like you could take a lot of wrong turns, put your philosophy in a lot of wrong directions. Section 4, it is easy to forget that Dewey is professionally a philosopher and that his work as a pedagogue is incidental to his main interests, for his influence has been both less marked and less widespread and philosophical than in educational and social circles. Nevertheless, Dewey was always a professor of philosophy who spoke about educational, psychological, political, and social affairs as a philosopher who considered these matters part of the total experience, which is the subject of philosophical inquiry. Dewey had no use for the traditional philosophies. He threw out Aristotelianism and its scholastic derivative because it held what Dewey called the, quote, spectator theory, that the mind should conform to outside reality in knowing things. He also rejected these theories because they sought certainty, tried to deduce immutable laws, and endeavored to arrive at ultimate and eternal truths. Dewey ruled out these and all other philosophies in the Western tradition for being dualistic. That is, for conceiving of reality in terms of body and spirit, matter and form, mind and outside reality, essence and accident, and so on. For Dewey had reinforced his temperamental hunger for unity with Hegelian and Darwinian theories. Oh, I guess the synthesis. So Hegel solves his problem. That made the knower and the known both somehow part of the same biological and material matrix. In Dewey's opinion, philosophy should be considered a verb rather than a noun. It might be described as thinking become conscious of itself, or as inquiry conducted according to established scientific procedures. He believed that all past philosophy put false emphasis on purely intellectual, abstractive processes that made little or no contact with real situations and had no practical utility. Philosophy recovers itself, he wrote in 1916, when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men. He believed that philosophy arises out of problems originating in social life. It is thinking which attacks unsolved problems, defines and restates them, and proposes solutions which can be applied in such a way as to reconstruct society. It is not misleading to say that the task of philosophy is to solve social problems if we remember that the philosopher is concerned with methods of inquiry and with criticizing erroneous solutions as well as errant philosophies. Because philosophy interprets all experience from a social or sociological approach, it is intimately connected with education, and eventually, one may say, philosophy becomes a general theory of education. That might be a little bit of a stretch for me. The problems Dewey thought confronted philosophy are obviously not the problems with which Aristotle, St. Thomas, Descartes, Kant, and Hegel wrestled. William Kelly Wright concludes his discussion of Dewey by saying, perhaps the correct interpretation of Dewey's general philosophy of experience is to say that he cares nothing for the ultimate problems with which nearly all great philosophers before him have been concerned. In his quest for certainty, Dewey tells us that the problems of philosophy are twofold. One, the problem of restoring integration and cooperation between man's beliefs about the world in which he lives and his beliefs about values and purposes that should direct his conduct is the deepest problem of any philosophy that is not isolated from that life. In other words, philosophy should end the alienation between what is and what it says should be, or Dewey explains, between the belief in things due to natural science on the one hand and moral or ethical beliefs on the other. Two, the second problem of philosophy is, quote, the problem of the relation of physical science to the things of ordinary experience. This is a problem of methodology of inquiry, which is the first problem to be solved for any sound philosophy. These problems or tasks of philosophy have been presented in another way by Dewey when he tells us that philosophy must first of all criticize its existing aims in the light of science, and then discriminate between those aims which have become obsolete and those which can be reconstructed to meet current social situations. For Dewey, thought is a continuous process, and the old distinctions between concepts, abstractions, judgments, and such, which are based on the, quote, spectator theory of knowledge and on bad psychology, must be considered simply and entirely as distinctive functions or divisions of labor within the doubt inquiry process. In later years, Dewey analyzed reflective or philosophic thinking as involving 5 steps. It always starts with a problem, in this case illustrated by a hiker confronted by a muddy ditch. The first step is to think up alternative solutions, to jump over the ditch, to walk around it, or to lay a board across it. Next, you intellectualize the problem by deciding how difficult the jump or how long the walk will be. The third step is to consider guiding ideas or hypotheses, such as whether an available board is long enough. Then you examine each hypothesis in the light of your past experience. How far have you jumped, for example, or how well you have handled long, heavy boards. Finally, you experiment with the more probable hypothesis. You may take a trial jump beside the ditch to make sure you can cover the distance between dry ground on the banks. But I would just say if that ditch has been there forever and a million people have walked across it before and you know the answer because your parents told you. I'm not even going to say because science tells you or a bunch of people, because your parents told you it's in your backyard. That's wisdom. That's heirloom knowledge. That's the classics. This stuff is also true, but this is just common sense. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to have formal education. Sending people to go to school to learn the classics, like sending everybody to college, doesn't make sense. Not everybody is made for that. Not everybody needs that. There are some basics. 3 R's, as my mother would say. There are the basics. And actually, if you teach people the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic, they can do everything. If they're interested in anything, they can read. So you don't have to teach them formally. Maybe some stuff, up to whatever, 5th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade, whatever you want. But the problem isn't how to reconstruct education to teach people how to figure out how to cross a ditch. The thing is, if they need to know about how to cross a ditch, let them live like this guy did. He's so smart. You know what I'm trying to say? Anyway, Dewey insists that thinking is a kind of activity, quote, as natural to the human animal as breathing or eating. There's nothing revolutionary in this idea, as so many of his followers seem to think. The revolutionary point is Dewey's insistence that every thought is, quote, a gesture made toward the world. That thinking is an activity which changes or modifies both the thinker and the material of his thought. Thus, Dewey tells us that, quote, the function of thinking is the management of experience. And its purpose is not only continually to reconstruct experience, but also to reconstruct and rearrange the world. This is where you get the liberal stuff. This is what I remember thinking distinctly with Obama. It seems to me that these people think if you change man, you change the world. And that's at direct odds of the I guess I'm saying pre-modern. I'll find out from Scott and William if I've got that right. That human nature is thus. And human nature is thus, in my opinion, either because God brought it down, made us this way to work with his creation. You don't believe that? Then it's what's emerged. You believe in evolution, then you should understand that there's a relationship. There is a human nature. Yes, maybe it changes every couple of million years, but Dewey's not going to change the world because of that. And the disruption, especially since the morality of it, the ethics, the consequences, he doesn't take seriously, it seems like to me. He actually rejects the whole concept. Anyway. Such a philosophy, which denies the spectator theory of knowledge, cannot accept the traditional definition of truth as conformity of the knowing mind to objective reality. Yeah, that's what I like, if you haven't figured that out. The nature of truth for Dewey flows. And by the way, it doesn't matter. This table is hard. If this table is a figment of my imagination, it does not matter. If someone takes a hammer and slaps it on my thumb on this table, it's going to hurt. It does not matter. You don't need to know. Whatever. You don't need to smell your own farts, as I guess I would say. To use the South Park reference. The nature of truth for Dewey flows naturally from his experimentalist philosophy as a process of doubt-inquiry. It is, he tells us, a corollary from the nature of thinking and ideas. The conception of truth follows as a matter of course. Truth is what works. It is the hypothesis which, when put into effect, accounts for the data and solves the problem at hand. Method is most important in Dewey's philosophy. Whereas previous philosophers were concerned primarily with knowing reality, Dewey's chief concern is manipulating it. For the quid est of other philosophers, he substitutes how. We know an object when we know how it is made, he has written, and we know how it is made in the degree in which we ourselves make it. His philosophy, therefore, becomes one of techniques rather than concepts. This is logical because, as Erwin Edmund has put it, to Dewey, reality is change. The universe is process, and one of the processes that goes on in that complex species known as man is the process of thinking itself, which intervenes in and to a certain extent can modify and control the changes and chances of existence. In contrast to some of the 18th century philosophers who wanted to retain only nouns and to supplant verbs with mathematical symbols. Dewey had a predilection for adverbs and adjectives, and he wanted to replace many nouns with verbs. Quote, "It is a plausible prediction," he wrote, "that if there were an interdiction placed for a generation upon the use of mind, matter, consciousness as nouns, and we were obliged to employ adjectives and adverbs, conscious and unconsciously, mental and mentally, material and physically, we should find many of our problems much simplified." In this way, he refused to consider mind as an entity. Mind is primarily a verb. Yes, I mind very much. It denotes all the ways we deal consciously and expressly with the situation in which we find ourselves. Thus, mind and matter are different aspects which natural events assume in experience. Mind is, quote, "a distinctive way of participating in the course of events." At the risk of repetition, we must stress the key doctrine which is forever showing up in Dewey's writings. What he considers the incorrect distinction between knowing and doing, or theory and practice, in previous philosophers, which follows from their wrongful location of the object of knowledge outside of and antecedent to the knower, wrong methodology is bound to result. Dewey illustrates this by telling how one who wants to deal with the perplexities of domestic life is met with assertions about the sacredness of the person or the naturalness of the family as a social unit. These assertions are not held as hypotheses to be tested, but as truths already established. This, Dewey insists, precludes any sound philosophical inquiry. This is really, I'm just not grokking it. I'm so mad. I'm so mad that the Musk X Twitter continuum stole Grok. Really pisses me off. It's almost like they hijacked it so that we no longer had the concept of Grok. Pisses me off. Anyway, the proper method for reflective thinking or philosophic inquiry, according to Dewey, is to begin with the gross, macroscopic, crude subject matters in primary experience. By this, Dewey means we should not start with an idea of man or the state or justice, but rather with concrete situations such as the problem of integration in its political, social, and psychological settings in a given community. This situation is for philosophy what the subject matter revealed by laboratory experiment is for science. Okay. In How We Think, Dewey sums up the complete process thus. The two limits of every unit of thinking are a perplexed, troubled, or confused situation at the beginning, and a cleared up, unified, resolved situation at the close. The first of these situations may be called pre-reflective. It sets the problem to be solved, but out of it grows the question that reflection has to answer. In the final situation, the doubt has been dispelled. The situation is post-reflective. There results a direct experience of mastery, satisfaction, enjoyment. Between these two termini of inquiry, the philosopher must follow scientific methods of thought. He uses science to describe and analyze the gross experience, to classify it, and to bring it under laws. Thus, he arrives at hypotheses which Dewey considers candidates for truth. Or, sorry, I have a kid emergency. Hold on a second. just have to. My son, try to teach him how to get his own little Ubers, but is waiting for him and he's not there. Okay. Hope that works. Mm-hmm. Thus, he arrives at hypotheses which Dewey considers candidates for truth or probable solutions of the problem. These are tested experimentally and thus found true or rejected as false. This final step of experiment is an essential part of Dewey's method, for he insists, as we have seen, that one cannot know what he does not make or control, and this can be done only by the controlled experiment usually associated with laboratory experiments in the natural sciences. But for Dewey, the reconstruction of experience is the analogous step in philosophy and is equally important in arriving at true conclusions. In earlier years, experimentalism was the term most frequently used to designate Dewey's philosophy. But in his later lifetime, it receded into the background in favor of the term instrumentalism. The former refers primarily to method, the latter to the whole complex of Dewey's thought. It has been well described by Morton G. White in these words: instrumentalism is Dewey's doctrine, which holds that ideas are plans of action and not mirrors of reality, that dualisms of all kinds are fatal, that the method of intelligence is the best way of solving problems, and that philosophy ought to free itself from metaphysics and devote itself to social engineering. Thus, truth is made functional or instrumental in effecting the transition from a relatively conflicting experience to a relatively integrated one. This definition of truth is pragmatic, of course, but it goes beyond mere pragmatism to insist that a true idea also contains a plan of action or operation. Dewey did not object to the label of pragmatism for his philosophy, but he protested strongly that it was radically different from utilitarianism or hedonism. The basic stuff of Dewey's philosophy is experience. It is for him what being is for St. Thomas and the scholastics. The subject of inquiry, the ultimate entity with which the philosopher grapples. Although it is the most important term in Dewey's philosophy, it is difficult to determine exactly what he means by it or to put any limitations on it by definition. All that we know is experience, and it is useless, following Dewey, to inquire whether anything else exists, for to bring it within the compass of our knowledge is to make it part of our experience. In his introduction to Dewey's collected works, Joseph Ratner tells us that the only genuine passport, the only passport commanding entrance into being, reality, nature, or whatever else you care to call it, by capital letter or small, is the passport that is filled out, signed, countersigned, stamped, and sealed by public experience. For Dewey, experience is not only the stuff of philosophy, but it also serves as a constant reference point and control on philosophical argument. Dewey opposes the view that experience is an affair of knowledge to insist that it is an affair of the intercourse of a living being with its physical and social environment. A good description of this important but slippery term in Dewey's thought is given by Reverend Farrar Smith, O.P. Experience, like matter, mind, body, mind, and the rest, is something that is transacted in nature, arising within it and in consequence of its interaction. It is not of a self, not subjective nor yet objective, not set off from reality as a reaction to it or copy of it. Experience is approached behavioralistically, not as evidence of a substance, but as a mode. It is an affair of the interaction of organism and environment. Both are implicated within it. It is characterized by change, the conjunction of the relatively stable and relatively contingent. That is the condition of nature. So it includes habit and impulse, mind and consciousness, having and being and thinking. So it embraces the earth and the stars, birth and death, life and growth. experiences all these and none of them exclusively. It is assimilated to history as deep and wide and full as all history on this earth. The other term most frequently used to describe Dewey's philosophy is naturalism. He tells us that philosophy can accept only natural events in which matter expresses their sequential order and mind the order of their meanings in their logical connections and dependencies. Instrumentalism is a naturalistic theory of truth, and our knowledge is itself an emergent natural event. Dewey rejects all supernaturalism, the subsistence of ideas, and anything that transcends the natural events of common experience. In Dewey, then, experimentalism, instrumentalism, and naturalism are descriptions from different viewpoints of the same philosophy. I don't know, man. He's not my guy, and I'm not like really understanding how deep it is. I assume that the whole point is that it gutted education, and that's what was wanted. And since he covered it up in a bunch of gobbledygook, it was easy to pass it off as intellectual stuff. I don't know. That's what I'm getting out of this. Anyway, we'll pick up with section 5. I better deal with whatever's going on there. And thank you very much. And if you would continue to remember Joe in your prayers, send up some love. It's super, super sad, a real loss. And, shouts out to the people in our community who got super close to him. So we pray for you too. Thank you very much.